So with that, we've been getting some really relevant and interesting questions. I'm going to start with one that came from the audience, and is a really good one, pertaining to the partnership with physician specialty societies. And if the panel can comment on the impact and how it fits together, the component of practice guidelines, clinical practice guidelines, into the reimbursement equation. So if you can start with commenting on that, that'd be great.
Tina, do you want to take that?
Thank you, Gordon. Hello, everyone. Yes, very important to have specialty society alliances very early, very often. It's important for every component of reimbursement. Medical guidelines, of course, hold a lot of weight, but especially while you're going for any type of coding application, if you want to alter something that directly impacts the physicians within the society, if you don't get them involved early, your application will not go anywhere. And from the perspective of working with a bigger payer, if you have the backing of a specialty society and you can point to guidelines to create coverage, that is ideal. Wade, do you have anything to offer as well?
Particularly for coding, I agree that alignment with specialty societies is critical. One of the issues here is that sometimes specialty society guidelines that recognize a new innovation is somewhat delayed until after some critical clinical trials are done that meet the society's evidence-based approach to guidelines, and also payers' need for well-designed clinical trials. So it may be a while. It's not something that happens immediately when a new device hits the market or is being introduced and studied. It sometimes occurs a little bit later. So if there's some process perhaps to speed that up, but the bottom line is that payers will look at medical guidelines in terms of the evidence that supports those guidelines. Opinion-based guidelines have much less weight than evidence-based guidelines. So my point is that there may be a delay.
Claude, could I add a comment to that?
Yes.
I fully agree with Tina's and Wade's comments. I'd also like to congratulate ShipMD because a crucial partner in this process is the American Academy of Pediatrics. So there is already a central player on this issue of specialty societies, clinical practice guidelines, the generation of data, as Wade said, and coding. But it is also a complex world because the urologists, the orthopedic surgeons, the neurologists, the oncologists are all part of the playing specialty societies responsible here. So we've got a multi-group stakeholder in that specialty societies who need to be part of the conversation.
If I can add to that, so I am a American Academy of Pediatrics member. We have a section on urology, but we also have another section that was brought up by one of the audience members. We have a section of Advances in Therapies and Technology, or SOAT, S-O-A-T-T. And this is a society, a section that all members are allowed to join. But in that section, we definitely concentrate on innovations both for pharmaceuticals as well as technology that includes devices. So I'm on the leadership team. I run the newsletter. We publish stories on innovative devices. We talk about the device consortia. So definitely I would say that AAP has been a strong advocate for pediatric devices. Their legislation that they sponsored or helped to sponsor led to the PDC program, and they're very much integral members and partners for ShipMD. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This is clearly an important question, but I want to go back to something that Wade mentioned that I think is critical to this conversation. That's the concept of the supporting evidence to make what kind of decisions, right? And so there's the regulatory side of things, but then there's the reimbursement side of things. So Wade, from your experience with Medicare and the Blue Cross Blue Shield system, can you elaborate on your experience on what those payers ask for in terms of supporting evidence and documentation, and even some of the clinical guidance components to move the needle ahead with reimbursement? You're muted, Wade.
Basically, they're looking for well-designed clinical trials that have appropriate inclusion, exclusion criteria, primary and secondary endpoints, study size to be statistically powered appropriately so that the results are statistically significant. And they're looking for, some reasonable follow-up. They're looking for studies done in different settings. So multi-center studies have an advantage over single site studies. They're also looking for the beneficial outcomes to be replicated in other studies. So it may not just be, one study, but more than one study that shows consistency of results over investigators and sites. There may be differences in that if you have a large multi-center trial, that may be sufficient in some cases. And in other cases, there may need to be, as I said, a second or more trials to show the consistency of beneficial outcomes. The Blue Cross Blue Shield system uses a 5 evidence-based criteria, basically looking at FDA approval, whether the evidence is sufficient to permit conclusions on the effect of the technology on health outcomes, whether beneficial effects outweigh harmful effects, whether it's at least as good as existing alternatives, and whether the results could be expected outside of a research or investigational setting. Those are the 5 Blue Cross Blue Shield criteria. It's a fairly high bar, and so I can talk further about some flexible coverage options, which I think is what we're looking for here in pediatric medical devices. But basically, they're looking for good studies, and they're also looking for the consistent application of their own standards. So one of the issues is that this is applied equally to adults and pediatrics. So the same standards that they use for adult medicine are also applied to pediatric medicine, and they don't. The payers don't want to be inconsistent with applying their own guidelines. So I think I'll stop there, but I can talk further about it if you'd like.
Yeah, no, that was a great one. So I think that connects with another question from the audience pertaining to the specific classification, right? In the case like for a 510K situation, where that is going to come from, especially linking that to a reimbursement. So you could elaborate on that as well.
Well, 510K is FDA clearance, based on a predicate device, and the amount of evidence that's available for that indication is generally much less than under a PMA. So, in fact, that's one of the complaints of payers is that devices go on the market with very little evidence of improved health outcomes and durability based on a 510K clearance. The 5 Blue Cross Blue Shield criteria that I mentioned, FDA approval or clearance is just one. But payers look beyond that. They look at the actual application and studies to show improved health outcomes, to demonstrate basically a measure reimbursement requirements that are beyond FDA clearance. So it's more of an issue with 510K than it is with PMA, because many of the PMA studies are very good and will generate a positive reimbursement decision. But it's much more variable under 510K.
Yeah,
if I could tag on to that, Klaus, if you don't mind. So sometimes what you have when you have a 510K cleared device is that something that fits within existing reimbursement structures. So you may be able to kind of just slide into whatever exists currently without having to recreate a lot of the technical components like the coding. And if the payment is appropriate for those centers who are going to be using, or physicians who are going to be using your device, occasionally you can fit into the coverage, the coding, the payment, and come to market with reimbursement. But as payers kind of realize that they have they've always known that they have a limited budget for spend, they may start to parse out. Typically, coverage is made on a procedural level, not on a device level. So if you're coming into the market like we did with a better way or a pediatric indication for our left ventricular assist device. So we just got our pediatric indication. We did not have to recreate coverage, coding, and payment. It fit within the existing paradigm. So it really does depend on what you already have researched, and doing a reimbursement analysis early on before you decide on your pricing. Just see what's out there is vital.
Yeah, that's a really valid point. And since if I can just probe you a little bit more to elaborate on your experience with manufacturers directly on how to run that kind of an assessment in approaching payers and the avenues that they have in front of them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always about whether you fit in, whether you want to fit in. So if you can design your device slightly differently, if you would normally fit into a category where there is non-coverage, you need to really just make some early R&D level or clinical trial level decisions. So reimbursement should get a seat at the table as early as possible in any device innovation, so that you really have a good understanding of where you're fitting. So we always work with even pre-research and development, like just the idea, and we have a whole ventures group that looks at acquisitions from a reimbursement capacity as well as certainly from a commercialization capacity. But we're a big company. So when you're a smaller company, you need to develop relationships with consultants like Gordon. When we were small as Thoratec making our LVADs, we used Gordon to make sure that we were on the right path, that we were designing the trial correctly, the endpoints would meet payer scrutiny. And another point is that if you are thinking through your reimbursement story and you can build in some way to measure value to the payers into your design of your trial, you will be in a much better position when you want to ask for something. If you can show a true data-driven case for your reducing costs, you're increasing mortality, your ICER, your, I don't want to get into the technical components of what payers will look at, but honestly, any device that is kind of coming to market needs to have that reimbursement component well thought out before they even get close to FDA submission. Right, Gordon?
Yes.
You're muted, darling.
Can I add to that? I think I agree with Tina. I mean, early reimbursement planning is critical. A lot of companies, I think, focus on the FDA regulatory pathway and how payers view their technology as sort of a later thought. But really, when you're designing your clinical trials, you should be thinking of endpoints that are relevant to payers at the same time you're looking at your FDA regulatory requirements. And in Medicare, for CMS and FDA have offered some meetings to discuss endpoints, to companies that are developing products and want to, in which there's a Medicare population being served, and they want to make certain that they're not only meeting FDA requirements, but Medicare coverage requirements at the same time, which is, I think on the commercial side, is something for companies to think about, and think about it earlier rather than later in designing clinical trials. And I agree that economic endpoints are also important.
Claus, can I pick up on it? It gets back to both the points about 510K, IDE, PMA. Once upon a time, one of the crucial and almost best strategy for manufacturers was to use a 510K, because after 90 days they could get on the market. Exactly as Wade and Tina have said, you can be on the market because you've shown you're equivalent to another device, but without the data needed by payers. Even under an IDE PMA, that may not capture the right data that payers need. So early in the regulatory thinking, what once was, gee, we got an FDA approval, shouldn't we get coverage? The answer is no, because that whole data set on improvement in net health outcomes, cost effectiveness, is not part of the FDA process. So I'm very pleased to hear we're looking at what a manufacturer has to consider when it's going through any one of a couple of FDA approaches.
And this is beautifully coalescing in this discussion as to then how SHIP is going to provide that kind of a framework in the thinking. So if I could ask you guys to comment on how you see SHIP providing that conduit to have those conversations and instill those thinking points early in the process to help manufacturers with that.
Can I add, just maybe reframe that question just a little bit? We talked in the presentation, we've talked in the Workstream about a Medicaid NTAP program or a pediatric NTAP program. And as someone that's a novice to reimbursement, to hear about the potential for payment to come in at the time in the developmental stages to acquire that data that could be created for evidence-based guidelines. If we can maybe talk about how maybe SHIP-MD can help create perhaps a Medicaid NTAP program, and what are your thoughts, Wade and Gordon, about that?
Gordon, why don't you start with that?
Very important opportunity, because it would be, I think, a tremendous opportunity for SHIP to be the place where we're pulling together two branches of the Department of Health and Human Services at the national level, FDA and CMS, but also bringing into that conversation one or two or three state Medicaid programs. The state Medicaid programs pretty much have to put the money on the table, and they are going to be cautious. They may even say, we'd love to do it, but we don't have enough money to do it. So what SHIP can, I think, be looking for is, where the dollars? Follow the money. And if there is some funding available at the top of the Department of Health and Human Services place that can flow down to the state Medicaid program, that is a discussion which SHIP can uniquely start. And they can be helpful in directing how that flow of additional dollars, whether it's an NTAP, additional payment to the hospital, it could be even on an inpatient or an outpatient basis, and also to the physician. SHIP can play a great role because they are already parts of those participants and stakeholders in its consortium.
Yeah, great. No, that was beautiful, because that's what starts putting things into a tangible kind of framework for how SHIP is going to operate. But we have a really good question from the audience in terms of what can be done in terms of reimbursement now in 2021 to inform this conversation as SHIP is getting off the ground before it gets formally launched. So if you have any ideas about that, please do comment.
Tina, you want to start? What can SHIP do right now?
Yeah, or what can you do when SHIP is starting up to be prepared to be a SHIP member? Maybe is the real essence of the question, I think, Klaus. And so, you know, all of the things that we've just touched on a little bit are important. Getting a seat at the table, understanding the reimbursement for your product, researching what else is out there, what coverage is out there. Medicare has a beautiful coverage database, so start there. And then once you have an idea of the codes, et cetera, you can then look on Medicaid agency websites, which are notoriously firewalled and convoluted. It's a little bit more difficult to find state Medicaid policy, commercial payer policy. So research those sites where you have either places where you intend your product will be, you think your product will be used, maybe for people who are your true believer, early pioneers with your device. So those states, and then payers that are bigger in those states, see if there's existing policy for that. Align with some specialty societies with your device. So make introductions, talk about what you're working on. You'll be more well prepared if you start those things now, this year, and then, you know, you'll be sailing into the SHIP program a lot easier.
Clark, if I can just build on Tina's, I think the lowest hanging fruit for SHIP is a educational document or website or resource. If the program is to go into its second phase, third phase, to generate a reimbursement navigational guide for innovative pediatric devices, a joint publication of the FDA, of CMS, of a couple of state Medicaid programs, just to explain the process that Tina laid out, I think is something that can be done rapidly, and it addresses that we've got a complex scenario. If we give a little education about what is the difference between coverage coding and payment, where do you go for those decisions, that may help in the early planning. That doesn't require structural changes in the agency. It doesn't require generating more money. That's what we want to do. But what can we do in the next 6 or 8 months? We could probably get people like Tina and Wade and Chester and others to pull that document together and put it up on the CMS, Medicaid, FDA website.
Okay.
So let me add a little bit to that. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that not all innovations pan out. And I think from the payer's point of view, they feel that there's a burden of evidence on the developer or the sponsor of a new technology. Now, certainly there are novel devices, and then there are category B, sort of incremental improvements. And in Medicare, certainly category B devices are recognized for early payment. But I think one thing I would stress is that well-designed studies need to be done, and taking shortcuts and trying to get something on the market, 510K, without really studying it well for its new application it's not going to resonate well with payers. So first thing I would say is do well-designed studies and make early and continue to build an evidence base. I'd also say that there are some existing mechanisms in place in Medicare and in the commercial sector for flexible coverage with evidence development. And certainly an innovator that has a new device that has the potential and a high potential for being successful and to being of high value might be able to make a case for flexible coverage with evidence development. That's under the clinical trials policy at Medicare, and it potentially could be argued sort of case by case, along with the other things that Tina and Gordon have mentioned. So those are some things that could be done right now. I think once SHIP is developed, it becomes a national center and a national network, and that, to me, raises the possibility that some major national health plans could adopt SHIP and flexible coverage for SHIP, just as they do in their own national networks. The Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, for example, has national networks that they call Blue Distinction. And for pediatric cancer, they're generally, more flexible on coverage and reimbursement under NIH guidelines for rare tumors, for example. So I think there's some short-term and long-term possibilities. Certainly when SHIP is up and mature and running, it has the potential for being very attractive to national payers.
If I could add, I mean, some of the resources that are available now, as you saw the map of the 5 pediatric device consortia that are funded by the FDA through P50 grants, we all help pediatric device innovators in a no strings attached, no equity taken mode. So some of the assistance is actually available now. I would really, I really suggest that if you're a pediatric device innovator looking for help now, that you align yourself with one of them. And one way that we could help is potentially, and some of this is dependent on intake form and learning about you, but one way that we have helped others is to provide some reimbursement strategy support, maybe perhaps pay for some of the hours of a reimbursement consultant towards building that regulatory strategy to help you better understand what the reimbursement strategy moving forward for your particular device. So that's available now. These are consortia all across the country, and if you haven't reached out yet for your device, I'd recommend it.
Great. Now that was a great set of comments and discussions. Now, the getting back to the notion of what SHIP can do and what it could do eventually in the future, and especially with this distinction about the efficacy metrics that FDA cares about versus the more effectiveness metrics that payers tend to care about. Would you have any notion as to how SHIP could also help with another hot topic these days, the notion of real-world data and converting those data into real-world evidence, especially for the health economics and effectiveness side of the equation for reimbursement?
Klaus, let me start off, but I think Wade probably and Chester, who's generating that information. Real-world evidence, a very important new concept, particularly in the FDA space. How much do you have to show, and what's the sources of that information in order to get the FDA to approve it, to demonstrate that it's safe and effective for particular indications? I would suggest that the payers want more than just real-world evidence of safety and effectiveness. If you've got real-world evidence of improvement in net health outcomes, substantial clinical improvement compared to the alternative, then I think real-world evidence is going to speak to the needs of the payers. But I think where SHIP can be important is trying to translate some of those newly emerging regulatory approval concepts over to the payer side. And also your point, I think, is tremendously important. Is there an analog in the real world evidence, which is a clinical measure in the economic space. How do you prove that it's cost effective with real world evidence? I actually think that is a area that SHIP could be of particular value in trying to come up with real world evidence in a cost effectiveness context.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm sorry, Tina, do you want to go ahead?
One thing, Wade, I just want to mention that on the real world evidence, I have an example of that, not in the pediatric space, but we used, the databases, the claims databases that are available to create a story that showed a payer, their specific population was already being treated and they should remove the prior authorization requirement, because every time we could show them using real world claims data, not necessarily real world clinical data, that those patients were getting approved every time they were being treated and had excellent outcomes. So that was a way to remove a barrier that we used, and we've also done the same thing for a Medicare program that was considering a non-coverage of one of our devices. Just look at their population. So that real-world evidence in practice, in my experience, works fantastic.
Yeah, I would just say that real-world evidence is important, and payers are incredibly interested in looking at their own populations to see how coverage decisions they've made or new technologies that have been introduced, how they're being used and what kind of outcomes they see in their own population. I would say that it's supplementary rather than taking the place of good clinical trials in a research setting that are published in peer-reviewed journals for initial coverage decisions. And I would say that I think payers are particularly looking at real-world evidence in the sense of durability of treatment effect and device longevity. Kaiser Permanente for implantable devices has been looking at that for a long time. They have registries of device implants and looking for, how much longevity they have or whether they fail. So there are a lot of uses for real-world evidence, but I think in the initial determination of whether a new device improves health outcomes and benefits outweigh harms and all the other points that I made, I think they're really looking at clinical trial research evidence as a primary review, supplemented by real-world evidence.
Right, and then I could add to this, from a pediatric device standpoint, going back to the pediatric device consortia, 3 of the 5 consortia, including our site, do have the additional funding from the FDA consortia program for real-world evidence demonstration projects. And basically, I think what it's doing, and I give credit to the program officers and to the RFA, or the request for applications, for this cycle, but I would think that what we're doing is we're providing an actual use of real-world evidence that then our FDA partners can look at that and see how can they best regulate and oversee real-world evidence as it's used for device approvals. And so I think this is still I would call it a work in progress, but hopefully these demonstration projects will give them the needed experience with real-world evidence so that for future applications as we review them that include real-world evidence, that they'll definitely be more informed. So.
Absolutely, and I think we're getting back to one of the points that Tina made about value-based reimbursement. I mean, at the end of the equation. But one thing that, and I think there's another question in the audience that pertains to this. What happens once you get a regulatory decision made and you're navigating the reimbursement equation rather successfully? Then getting back to the notion of the real-world data, real-world evidence equation, how that can help also spearhead some additional regulatory decisions for labeling expansions, those kinds of things, and how that also feeds into the reimbursement equation. So can you also comment on that?
I can somewhat, yes. I'll be happy to start at least the conversation. What you should think of is that reimbursement is never done. You might have a great situation right now, but it could either always be better or it can go away in a heartbeat. So you have to care and feed for your reimbursement situation in a different way than you do your regulatory, right? So your regulatory, you kind of, you get it and it's there. So as you build your story for reimbursement, you should always be thinking, if you're doing any type of multi-center work and collecting data, to build in some of those economic endpoints that you're collecting so that you can continue to show that you are of value to the healthcare universe. And I think why that's so important right now as well is that I think Gordon alluded to the fact that Medicaid agencies can just say, hey, we don't have any more money. And that is a real truth in that universe right now, with the year that we just came away from and the ongoing maintenance of all of the COVID-19 endpoints. And if you look at some of the numbers on enrollment for state Medicaid agencies, they are going up. So more population, lower budgets, harder for innovation to take hold and get attention unless you can prove something from an economic perspective. So ongoing maintenance of your reimbursement story is going to be vital.
So I might add that, certainly a lot of medical technologies and devices initially are approved for a certain indication, and there may be a positive coverage decision by a payer for certain indications, certain populations, generally based on the clinical trial evidence. And it's certainly a usual story that the expansion of indication occurs over time. And I think that payers are a little bit more flexible, and it sort of depends on the individual case as to whether they'll be flexible about expanded indications or whether they'll require additional clinical trial evidence or may be satisfied with some real-world evidence. And I think it's hard for me to answer that, sort of in general. But I think it underscores the importance of getting a pediatric medical device approved for an indication and covered by payers for an indication, because it's much easier to get an expansion of coverage as additional data is generated than it is to get that first coverage decision. So generate good data that'll be compelling to regulators and payers early on in the story, and then continue to build evidence as you go along.
Klaus, I want to make sure if you've got any other questions from our audience, we give them a chance to weigh in. My impression is we're coming down to the last minutes or so. I did have one final comment, but I would prefer to hear from our audience if there's anything out there that's coming in, whether it's a question or a comment.
Great segue, because I was just about to do that. There's two that I want to make sure that we cover. One is very specific to the presentation of the case study from the audience about the 5 millimeter tool. The question is if it was sunsetted because of reimbursement issues, and because it sounds like you have the tech you needed, but then it got lost, and the audience member is asking you to clarify and elaborate on that.
I can answer that. I would think part of the issues regarding 5 millimeter instruments is, unfortunately, they're used much less often than the 8 millimeter instruments. So I do think that the industry does have to make financial decisions, put the resources here, put the resources there. And my thought would be that the 5 millimeter instruments just weren't generating enough volume for them to spend time. and then to develop it for the next model, which of course is developing cost in that. So I think that did play a part. There may be other reasons, but that is an example of what we face in pediatrics, that we are a smaller market. Can't do anything about it. We always will be a smaller market. But I think one thing that we hopefully can get to is that maybe perhaps the process can be faster, so speed, but also certainty in the process in terms of the reimbursement and regulatory aspects that hopefully will make it more incentivized for many to join this area.
That part of that incentives gets back to, I'm just going to hammer that point again, value-based reimbursement. If you show the value even for a small market, that's kind of the crux of the matter, showing that value so that the reimbursement is achieved. Okay, and the other one for Wade, if you can just go over the 5 points of evidence that you mentioned just one more time, because the audience wants to capture that one last time.
All right, very quickly. Number 1 is FDA approval or clearance if applicable. Number 2 is evidence must be sufficient to permit conclusions on the effect of the technology on health outcomes. Number 3 is the beneficial effects must outweigh the harmful effects. Number 4, the technology must be at least as beneficial as established alternatives. And number 5, the improvement must be attainable outside the investigational setting. I'm a former Blue Cross Blue Shield medical director. I also worked for the BCBSA for a while, so that's why I remember them.
Klaus, I had a final quick comment. I, again, don't want to preclude any, but part of our challenge is that device innovation is very dynamic and it changes. And the reimbursement opportunities need to move with the same kind of speed and progression of innovation. We heard yesterday, I think, a tremendous example from Olivia, who's got diabetes. She's using a continuous blood glucose monitor that's hooked in with an insulin pump. That's a perfect example of incremental ongoing innovation, where once they had just blood glucose monitors, now they got continuous blood glucose monitors. And they attach them to the insulin pumps. And as innovation evolves, reimbursement, coverage, coding, and payment have got to keep pace. And it's not just early during clinical trials. This is going to go on. After the products have launched, reimbursement has to stay there. So, final point, it's a dynamic technology space, and reimbursement has to stay dynamic as well.
Concluding comment. Any final thoughts from Wade, Tina, or Chester?
No. I think it's, I think there are a lot of possibilities here under SHIP once it's established.
I totally agree, and I do think that payers look upon pediatric devices with a little more grace than adult devices, so that is also a benefit.
And then if I could add, the one concept we talked about, in terms of can we have a pediatric or Medicaid NTAP program linked to breakthrough device designation? We know pediatric device designation, pediatric devices can get breakthrough designation today, but if there can be some certainty about that regulatory decision leading to a little more certainty about getting early payment in the developmental process, I think that would create an incentive. And that could be hopefully done within the ShipMD network or ecosystem to drive more investment and more people to join the area. And, a niche market, I think, which is most pediatric devices, you could have all that niche market as opposed to a small piece of a much larger market. So being small is not necessarily bad.
Klaus, I want to make sure we express our appreciation to you for leading the panel. I'd also like to offer a continuing open door, open window for Chester, Tina, myself, all the members of the Reimbursement Workstream to hear more from those who are attending here. It's a complex area. We do not have either a magic answer or a magic bullet. It's sufficiently complex. We would continue to benefit from all of your thoughts. And if it can just direct them to the SHIP executive leadership, we'll continue to take them into consideration. And thank all of the audience for whatever comments they've had and whatever future opportunities they would like to make us aware of.